Sometimes a man runs to the mountains to escape his past, only to find his future waiting in the most unexpected place. Jedediah Clark thought he'd spend his remaining years alone with his dog Boone, far from the mistakes that drove him from civilization. 40 years ago, on a cold morning, Boone starts barking at an old mine that's been sealed since 1979. Something inside calls to Jed, and when he digs his way in, he finds a boy, alive, wild-eyed, speaking a language he's never heard. The mine has been sealed for decades. How did this child survive in a mine sealed for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver collar around Boone's neck had belonged to another dog once, back when Jedediah Clark still believed in second chances. The metal was tarnished now, bearing the scratched name Rex and a phone number that hadn't worked in 20 years. Jed kept meaning to replace it with something plain, something that didn't carry ghosts, but habits die hard in the high country. At 68, Jed had weathered into the landscape like an old pine, gnarled, enduring, and comfortable with silence. His cabin sat in a clearing 8 miles north of Millbrook, Colorado, accessible only by a dirt track that turned to mud in spring and disappeared entirely under snow from November through March. The place suited him fine. 4 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out on nothing but ponderosa pines and the occasional elk. He quote-built most of it himself, those first desperate years, when keeping busy meant keeping sane. The logs came from trees he'd felled, with his own hands, each one chosen and placed with the methodical precision of a man who had nowhere else to be. The chinking was tight, the roof sound, and the foundation solid enough to outlast him, which was all he'd ever asked of anything. His morning routine hadn't changed in a decade. Coffee first, black and strong enough to wake the dead. Brewed in the same blue enamel pot his grandmother had used back in Kansas, then out to split kindling, while Boone made his rounds, marking territory and checking for overnight visitors, deer mostly, though they'd had a bear last spring that took a liking to his garbage. The weathered journal lay open on his kitchen table, a leather-bound witness to 40 years of mountain living. Today's entry would be brief, like all the rest. October 15th, clear skies, Boone restless. Simple observations for a simple life, though the pages themselves told a different story, one of gradual transformation from bitter, angry sentences to peaceful acceptance of solitude. The early entries were dark things, full of rage and self-pity. Day 127. Still here, still breathing. Can't say why. But time had a way of wearing down the sharp edges, and the later pages spoke of small contentments. A successful hunt, a roof repair completed before the rains, Boone's recovery from a porcupine encounter that had left them both wiser. Millbrook lay 23 miles south by the winding mountain road, though Jed rarely made the trip, except for supplies. The town had grown some since he'd first arrived, a few new houses, a coffee shop that served fancy drinks with foreign names, but it remained essentially what it had always been, a place where people minded their own business and asked few questions of a man who paid his bills in cash and kept to himself. Sarah Mackenzie ran the town's small medical clinic with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who'd seen everything twice. At 55, she was still handsome in the way mountain women were, strong-boned and clear-eyed, with calloused hands that spoke of practical competence. She'd been a nurse in Denver before her husband's death brought her back to care for her aging father, and she'd stayed on after the old man passed, finding purpose in tending to the ailments of loggers, ranchers, and the occasional tourist who misjudged a hiking trail. Tom Brennan had worn the sheriff's badge for 15 years, inheriting the job from his father and the steady suspicion that came with it. He was a careful man, methodical in his investigations, and slow to judgment, but he had the mountaineer's instinct for danger and the lawman's nose for secrets. He'd always wondered about the hermit up north, the way Jed paid for everything in cash and never quite met your eyes when he talked. The story of the Silver Point mine was local legend, the kind of tale that grew in the telling until fact and fiction tangled like morning glory vines. 3 prospectors had died in the avalanche of '79. Their bodies never recovered from the tons of rock and snow that sealed the entrance. Harold Kemper, Sam Rodriguez, and Danny O'Brien, names carved on a weathered marker at the town cemetery. Though no bodies lay beneath the stone dot, Jed had avoided the mine for 40 years, taking the long way around whenever his wanderings brought him near. There was nothing there for him now, nothing but memories and regrets and the kind of what-ifs that could drive a man to drink if he let them. Better to leave the dead buried and the past where it belonged. But Boone had other ideas. The dog was part border collie, part mystery, with one blue eye and one brown that seemed to see things others missed. Jed had found him as a pup, half-starved and shivering by the roadside, and they'd been inseparable ever since. Boone was getting on in years now, 9, maybe 10, and his muzzle showed grey, but his instincts remained sharp as winter wind. This morning, something had set him off. Instead of his usual patrol of their property line, he'd headed straight for the old mine trail, hackles raised and tail stiff with purpose. His barking echoed off the canyon walls, urgent and demanding, in a way that raised the hair on Jed's neck. "What's got into you, boy?" Jed muttered, following the sound through stands of aspen whose leaves whispered secrets in the morning breeze. The trail to Silver Point was overgrown now, choked with deadfall and bramble, marked only by rusted signs, warning of danger and unstable ground. The mine entrance had been properly sealed after the accident, concrete and steel, designed to keep the curious and the foolish from wandering into a death trap. But 40 years of freeze and thaw had taken their toll, opening cracks wide enough for a determined animal to squeeze through. Or a desperate child. Boone stood rigid at the concrete barrier, every line of his body screaming alarm. The barking had stopped, replaced by a low whine that spoke of distress beyond his ability to communicate. His nose worked frantically at a gap in the concrete, and when he looked back at Jed, his mismatched eyes held an urgency that cut through 40 years of careful indifference. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, desperately wrong, and, for the first time in decades, Jedediah Clark felt the old instincts stirring, the same ones that had once made him a man people turned to in times of trouble, before everything went sideways, and he learned that some problems couldn't be solved with good intentions and a willing heart. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of fog and revealing the mountains in all their austere beauty. Somewhere behind the concrete and steel, something waited in the darkness of the Silver Point mine. Something that had set his dog to barking like the world was ending. Jed stood at the sealed entrance, studying the cracks and calculating what it would take to widen them enough for a man to squeeze through. His pickup truck was parked a quarter-mile back down the trail, and in the bed was his old toolbox, wrenches and hammers and a crowbar that had served him well over the years. The smart thing would be to walk away. Call Tom Brennan. Let the sheriff handle whatever this was with proper equipment and backup. The safe thing would be to trust that whatever was in there had been in there for 40 years and could wait a few hours more. But Boone's whining cut through every rational argument, and deep in his chest, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, the pull of purpose, the weight of responsibility for something beyond his own survival. Whatever was behind that concrete barrier needed help, and for the first time since he'd run to these mountains, Jedediah Clark found himself caring about something other than being left alone. He headed back to the truck for his tools. Boone, trotting anxiously at his heels. The collar around the dog's neck caught the morning light, and for just a moment Jed could swear he heard an echo from 40 years past. Rex barking at shadows in the mine, trying to warn them of dangers they couldn't see coming. Some warnings came too late. But maybe, just maybe, this one had arrived right on time. The crowbar bit into concrete like a hungry thing, each strike sending vibrations up Jed's arms and into his shoulders. 40 years of mountain living had kept him strong, but the work was hard and the gap was narrow. Boone paced behind him, whining softly whenever Jed paused to catch his breath. It took 2 hours to open a hole wide enough for a man to squeeze through. When he finally set the crowbar aside and peered into the darkness beyond, the smell hit him first. Not the expected mustiness of a sealed tomb, but something else. Something alive. His flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing a passage that should have been choked with debris. Instead, the way lay clear, as if someone had been maintaining it all these years. The wooden support beams showed rot in places, but they held, and the floor was worn smooth by recent passage. "Hello?" Jed called out, his voice echoing strangely. "In the confined space. Anyone in there?" The answer came not in words, but in movement, a scrabbling sound from deeper in the mine, like a frightened animal seeking escape. Boone's whine rose to a keening note that made Jed's skin crawl. He squeezed through the gap, grateful for the LED flashlight that had replaced the old kerosene lanterns of his youth. The passage stretched ahead into darkness, following the natural contours of the mountain. This wasn't the main shaft that had been properly collapsed in '79. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist on any official map. 20 yards in, he found the first sign that someone had been living here. A makeshift shelter constructed from salvaged lumber and canvas, with a fire pit that still held warm ashes. Cans of food opened with a knife and scraped clean. A water container fashioned from a gallon milk jug. Someone had been surviving in this place, and recently. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jed called softly. "I just want to help." The scrabbling sound came again, closer now, and when his light found the source, Jed's breath caught in his throat. A boy, maybe 10 or 12 years old, crouched against the far wall like a cornered animal. His clothes were torn and filthy, his dark hair matted with dirt and worse things. But his eyes held an intelligence that cut through the feral desperation, and when he spoke, the words that came were like nothing Jed had ever heard. The language flowed like water over stones, musical and strange, with clicks and tones that seemed to come from some other world entirely. The boy's hands moved as he spoke, forming gestures that might have been sign language or simply the desperate attempt to communicate across an impossible divide. Around the boy's neck hung a pendant, a stone carving unlike anything from the local tribes. It was dark green, almost black, carved in intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the flashlight's beam. The workmanship was exquisite, unlike any Native American artifact Jed had seen in his years in these mountains. "Easy, son," Jed murmured, keeping his voice low and calm. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is Jed." The boy stopped speaking, his dark eyes fixed on Jed's face. Slowly, carefully, he raised one trembling hand and pointed at himself. "David," he said, the English word sounding strange after the liquid flow of his native tongue. Then he pointed at the pendant and spoke again, in his own language, a long string of words that sounded like an explanation or a story. Jed holstered his flashlight and pulled out his cell phone, grateful for the bars he picked up even this deep. "In the mountain," Sarah Mackenzie answered on the second ring. "Sarah, it's Jed Clark. I need your help up at the old Silver Point mine." "Jed, what on earth are you doing at—" "I found a boy. He's alive, but he's been living rough. Needs medical attention, and he doesn't speak English well." The silence stretched long enough that Jed thought he'd lost the connection. Then Sarah's voice came back, crisp and professional. "How old? 10, maybe 12, malnourished, definitely scared." "Sarah, he was living inside the mine, the sealed mine." "That's impossible. I'm looking at him right now. Can you come up here?" "I'm on my way. Don't move him unless you have to. And Jed, call Tom Brennan. This is going to need official attention." The Call ended, leaving Jed alone with the boy and the weight of questions that seemed to multiply with every passing moment. How long had the child been living here? Where had he come from? And how in God's name had he survived in a mine that had been sealed for decades? The boy, David, watched him with the wariness of something that had learned to fear human contact. When Jed moved slowly toward the makeshift shelter, David scrambled backward, clutching the pendant at his throat and speaking rapidly in his strange language. "It's okay," Jed said, keeping his hands visible and moving with the deliberate care he'd use around a wounded animal. "I'm just going to look around, see what you need." The shelter was a marvel of improvisation. The boy had somehow acquired tools, a knife, a small hatchet, coils of rope, and used them to create a living space from the detritus of the old mining operation. A sleeping area lined with canvas and old blankets, a food storage system that kept canned goods organized and dry, even a crude latrine dug into the soft earth away from the living area. But it was the drawings that stopped Jed cold. Covering every flat surface were sketches made with charcoal and bits of colored stone, maps of the mine system, incredibly detailed and accurate, portraits of faces Jed didn't recognize, men and women with features that suggested the same ethnic background as the boy, and everywhere, repeated in different sizes and configurations, the same symbol that decorated the pendant. A complex geometric pattern that seemed to pulse with meaning. David had followed him, staying just out of reach, but clearly eager to communicate something important. He pointed at one of the drawings, a map that showed passages Jed knew had been sealed or destroyed, and spoke urgently in his native tongue. Then he mimed digging, his small hands scooping at the air, and pointed deeper into the mine. "What are you trying to tell me, son?" Jed asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew. The sound of engines echoed from outside, Sarah's SUV, and behind it the deeper rumble of Tom Brennan's cruiser. David heard them too, and the fear that crossed his face was sharp as a blade. He grabbed Jed's sleeve, speaking rapidly and pointing toward the depths of the mine. "They're here to help," Jed said, though he wondered how true that would prove to be. In his experience, official help often came with complications that made problems worse instead of better. Sarah's voice called from outside, professional and reassuring. "Jed, we're here." David's grip tightened on his sleeve, and the boy's eyes held a desperation that went beyond simple fear of strangers. This child had secrets, secrets that had kept him alive in an impossible place, secrets that might explain how a sealed mine could shelter a survivor when it should have been nothing but a tomb. Jed looked down at the small hand clutching his shirt and made a decision that would change everything. Whatever this boy's story was, whatever had brought him to this dark place beneath the mountain, Jed would hear him out before he turned him over to official care. He owed him that much. He owed himself that much. "Come on, son," he said gently. "Time to meet some friends, but don't worry, I won't let anything happen to you." The pendant caught the flashlight's beam as David nodded, its dark surface reflecting depths that seemed to hold stories older than the mountain itself. Stories that were about to come into the light after years of hiding in the darkness, whether the world was ready for them or not. Sarah Mackenzie moved through the mine entrance with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd seen her share of emergencies. Her medical bag caught the light as she squeezed through the gap Jed had torn in the concrete, and her boots found sure footing on the uneven floor despite the darkness. "Sweet mercy," she breathed when her flashlight found David, crouched behind Jed like a frightened animal. The boy's condition was worse than she'd expected. Ribs showing through tears in his shirt, cheeks hollow with malnutrition, scratches and cuts that spoke of months of rough living. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They held an intelligence that seemed far older than his years, and when he looked at her, she felt as though she was being evaluated by someone who'd learned to read danger in a glance. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly, setting her medical bag down slowly and keeping her hands visible. "My name is Sarah. I'm here to help." David's response came in that liquid, musical language Jed had heard before. The words flowed together, like water, punctuated by gestures that seemed to carry as much meaning as the sounds themselves. Sarah glanced at Jed, eyebrows raised. Any idea what he's saying? Not a word, but he told me his name. David. That's about all the English I've heard from him. Sarah nodded and tried again, pointing to herself. Sarah, she said clearly. Then she pointed to the boy. David. The child's face lit up with something like relief. Sarah, he repeated, the pronunciation careful but clear. Then he launched into another stream of his native tongue, this time gesturing toward the deeper parts of the mine. He's been trying to tell me something about the mine itself, Jed said. Keeps pointing deeper in and making digging motions. From outside came the crunch of boots on gravel. Tom Brennan's voice echoed off the rock walls as he approached the entrance. Jed, Sarah, everything all right in there? David's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He pressed himself against the wall, eyes wide with terror, and began speaking rapidly in a whisper. The fear in his voice was unmistakable, even without understanding the words. It's okay, Sarah said quickly, moving between David and the entrance. Tom's a good man. He's not going to hurt you. But David was shaking his head violently, clutching the strange pendant at his throat. He pointed toward the mine's depths and spoke a single word that sounded like a name, Kelakan, then made a slashing gesture across his throat. Jed felt something cold settle in his stomach. The boy wasn't just afraid of authority figures. He was afraid of something specific, something connected to wherever he'd come from and whatever had driven him to seek shelter in an abandoned mine. Tom Brennan squeezed through the entrance, his sheriff's uniform catching on the rough concrete. He was a big man, built for intimidation when necessary, but he moved carefully when he saw the child. Well, I'll be damned, he said quietly. Where'd he come from? That's what we're trying to figure out, Sarah said. She'd managed to edge closer to David during the conversation, close enough to make a preliminary assessment. He's malnourished, but not critically so, dehydrated. Those cuts need cleaning, but none look infected. David watched the sheriff with the wariness of prey, eyeing a predator. When Tom took a step forward, the boy scrambled backward, speaking rapidly in his own language and pointing deeper into the mine. Easy there, son, Tom said, stopping where he was. Nobody's going to hurt you. That's when David did something that changed everything. He reached into a pocket of his torn jacket and pulled out a piece of paper, hand-drawn maps, incredibly detailed, showing passages and chambers that shouldn't exist. He spread them on the ground and pointed to specific locations, speaking urgently. Jed knelt beside the maps, studying them by flashlight. They were remarkably accurate. He recognized landmarks and formations he'd seen in his brief exploration, but they showed areas far beyond where he'd ventured. A network of tunnels and chambers that extended deep into the mountain. These are mining maps, Tom said, crouching down to get a better look, but they're not like any I've seen before. The detail work is incredible. David pointed to one section of the map and spoke that name again, Kelakan, but this time his voice carried a different tone. Not fear, but sadness. Deep, profound grief. Sarah had been studying the boy's face while the men examined the maps. Tom, I need to get him back to the clinic. He needs proper food, medical attention, and a safe place to sleep. Agreed. But we're going to need to figure out where he came from. Missing persons reports. Maybe contact the state about... David interrupted with a stream of words that sounded desperate. He grabbed Jed's sleeve and pointed at the maps, then at himself, then deeper into the mine. The message was clear. There was something down there, something important enough that a starving child had risked his life to protect it. What is it, son? Jed asked gently. What's down there? The answer came not in words, but in action. David reached for his charcoal and began drawing on the back of one of his maps. His small hands moved with surprising skill, sketching faces, adults clearly related to him by the similar features. Men and women with kind eyes and weathered hands. Family. The realization hit Jed like a physical blow. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a survivor, possibly the only one, of something that had happened to his people. The fear in David's eyes wasn't just general wariness. It was the specific terror of someone who'd seen his family destroyed. "Tom," Jed said quietly, "I think we need to take a look at those deeper passages." The sheriff frowned. "That mine's been unstable for 40 years. After the avalanche that killed 3 prospectors," Sarah finished. "But what if there's more to it than that?" David had been listening to their conversation with the intense focus of someone trying to understand a foreign language. Through context and tone, when Sarah mentioned the avalanche, he became very still. Then he pointed to the old mining maps spread before them and made a gesture that looked like an explosion, followed by the same throat-slashing motion he'd made when he heard Tom approaching. "He knows something about the 1979 accident," Jed said. "But that's impossible. He wasn't even born then." The boy seemed to understand that they were talking about him. He touched his chest and said "David," then pointed to the drawings of the adult faces and spoke several names in his own language. Family names, Jed realized. Then David pointed to the maps and spoke one more name, this one in heavily accented English. "Clark," the boy said clearly. "Jed Clark." The silence in the mine was absolute. Sarah and Tom stared at Jed, whose face had gone pale in the flashlight's beam. The boy knew his name, a child who'd been living in an abandoned mine, speaking a language none of them recognized, knew exactly who Jed was. "How does he know your name?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jed looked down at the boy's earnest face, at the pendant that caught the light like a dark star, at the maps that showed passages he'd thought were lost forever. 40 years of careful anonymity, of building a life where the past couldn't find him, and it had all come apart because a dog started barking at a sealed mine. "I don't know," he lied. But even as the words left his mouth, he could feel the weight of old truths pressing against the walls he'd built around them. David knew his name, because somewhere in this mountain, in the darkness beyond the maps, lay secrets that connected a 68-year-old hermit to a boy who shouldn't exist. Secrets that were about to demand their due, whether Jed was ready for them or not. The drive back to Millbrook took place in careful silence. David huddled in the back seat of Sarah's SUV with a blanket wrapped around his thin shoulders. Jed rode shotgun, watching the boy in the mirror and wondering how his carefully ordered world had come apart so quickly. Tom Brennan followed in his cruiser, radio crackling with periodic check-ins that made David flinch each time at Sarah's clinic. David submitted to medical examination with the resigned patience of someone accustomed to hardship. Sarah worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning wounds, checking for signs of serious illness, taking notes that would later become official documentation. The boy's English improved dramatically when it came to basic medical questions. Yes, no, hurt, okay, as if he'd learned survival vocabulary first. "He's been living rough for months," Sarah told Jed as they watched David accept a sandwich with the careful gratitude of someone who'd known real hunger. "But his survival skills are remarkable. Most children wouldn't have lasted a week in those conditions." "Most children don't know how to draw detailed mining maps from memory," Jed replied. Tom Brennan had been making phone calls, checking missing persons reports and contacting state authorities about unidentified children. The results were troubling. No matches anywhere, no reports of missing indigenous children, no record of anyone remotely resembling David in any database. "It's like he appeared out of thin air," Tom said, setting his phone aside. "But that pendant he's wearing, I've been thinking about it. The craftsmanship is too sophisticated for local tribes, and the stone looks like something I've never seen before." David had been listening to their conversation while eating, his dark eyes moving between their faces as he tried to follow the discussion. When Tom mentioned the pendant, the boy's hand moved instinctively to protect it, and he spoke rapidly in his own language. "He doesn't want to take it off." Sarah observed. "It's clearly important to him." That's when David surprised them all by reaching into his jacket and pulling out a photograph, old, creased, and faded with age. He placed it carefully on Sarah's desk and pointed to the people in the image. Jed, quote, "S breath caught in his throat." The photograph showed 4 men standing at the entrance to a mine, squinting in bright sunlight. 3 of them he recognized from the memorial marker in Millbrook's cemetery: Harold Kemper, Sam Rodriguez, and Danny O'Brien. The 4th man, younger than the others and standing slightly apart, was himself. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom breathed. "That's you, Jed. That's you 40 years ago." Sarah picked up the photograph, studying it carefully. The clothing, the equipment. This has to be from the late 70s, right around the time of the avalanche. David watched their reactions with the intensity of someone whose life depended on being understood. When Jed reached for the photograph, the boy didn't resist, but his eyes never left Jed's face. He spoke again, softer this time, and the word Kellican appeared in the flow of his native tongue. "You lied to me," Tom said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of law enforcement. "You told me you'd never had anything to do with that mine." Jed stared at the photograph, seeing his younger self looking back with eyes that still held hope. And purpose. That man had believed in justice, had thought he could make a difference in the world. That man had been tragically, dangerously wrong. "I worked with them for 6 months, he admitted. "Sam Rodriguez hired me to assess the geological stability of some of the older workings. There were rumors about unsafe practices, corners being cut to maximize extraction." What happened? The memories came flooding back despite 40 years of careful suppression. The late-night meetings in Denver hotel rooms, the manila envelopes full of documentation, the growing certainty that someone was running an illegal operation, extracting minerals without proper permits or safety protocols. We were building a case. Sam, Harold, and Danny had been documenting violations for months. They brought me in because I had mining experience and connections with federal regulators. We were going to blow the whistle on the whole operation. David had been listening with the fierce concentration of someone piecing together a puzzle. When Jed paused, the boy pulled out another item from his jacket, a small notebook, its pages water-stained but still readable. He opened it to a specific page and pointed to writing that was clearly in Jed's younger hand. Sarah read aloud, "November 15th, 1979. Final sample collection tomorrow. Sam says the assay results will be enough to shut them down permanently. God willing, we'll see justice done." She looked up at Jed. "This is your handwriting." "The avalanche happened the next day," Tom said quietly. 3 men died, and all the evidence was buried with them. "Not all the evidence," Jed said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I kept duplicates, samples, photographs, documentation, everything we'd gathered. I had them stored in a safety deposit box in Denver." David's reaction was immediate and dramatic. He stood up, speaking rapidly and pointing toward the mine, then at the notebook, then back at Jed. The desperation in his voice was unmistakable. "What is it, son? What are you trying to tell us?" The boy took a deep breath and spoke very carefully in English. "Family, my family, they find truth." The words hit Jed like a physical blow. David's family, the people in the drawings, the faces that looked so much like his own, had been looking for the truth about what happened in 1979. And somehow, that search had led them to the Silver Point mine and whatever fate had befallen them there. "Your family came here looking for information about the avalanche," Sarah said, understanding dawning in her voice. "They found something, didn't they?" David nodded vigorously, then pulled out his charcoal and began drawing on a napkin. This time, the sketch showed people entering a mine shaft, carrying equipment that looked like modern geological survey gear. Below that, he drew the same people trapped underground, and above them, an explosion that sealed the entrance. "They were murdered," Jed said, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "Just like Sam, Harold, and Danny." Tom Brennan's face had gone hard with the realization. Someone's been killing people to keep that secret buried. For 40 years, they've been willing to commit murder to protect whatever was really going on. In that mine, David reached across the table and touched Jed's hand, speaking softly in his own language. But this time, Jed thought he understood the emotion behind the words, if not their meaning. The boy was asking for help, not just for himself, but for justice for his family, for closure to a story that had been bleeding pain into the world for 4 decades. "The safety deposit box in Denver," Sarah said. "Do you still have access to it?" Jed nodded slowly. "I've been paying the fees for 40 years. Never thought I'd need what was inside, but I couldn't bring myself to destroy it either." "Then we have evidence," Tom said. "Evidence that might finally explain what really happened at Silver Point Mine." David smiled for the first time since they'd found him, an expression that transformed his thin face and made him look like the child he should have been allowed to be. He spoke again in English, the words careful but clear. "Find truth, find justice, find peace." Outside, the afternoon. Sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the town of Millbrook. Somewhere in those shadows, the people who'd killed David's family were still free, still protecting their secrets, still willing to murder anyone who got too close to the truth. But for the first time in 40 years, Jedediah Clark felt ready to face them. The conversation that followed stretched deep into the evening, with David curled in a chair by Sarah's fireplace, finally warm and fed and safe enough to let exhaustion claim him. But even in sleep, his hand remained protectively curved around the strange pendant, and his dreams seemed troubled by memories too dark for a child to carry. Sarah made coffee while Jed and Tom spread David's hand-drawn maps across her kitchen table, comparing them to official mining surveys from the county records office. The discrepancies were striking. Passages that appeared on David's maps, but nowhere in the official documentation, chambers marked with symbols that matched the patterns on the boy's pendant, and most troubling of all, access points that suggested the mine system was far more extensive than anyone had known. "These tunnels here," Tom said, pointing to a section of David's map that showed workings extending deep into the mountain's heart. "According to the county records, this area was never developed. Too unstable," they said. Jed studied the markings, feeling the weight of 40 years pressing against his memory. Sam Rodriguez mentioned something about that, said the company was working claims that didn't match their permits, extracting minerals from areas they had no legal right to touch. What kind of minerals? That's what we were trying to figure out when everything went sideways. Sarah returned with coffee, her face thoughtful. "I've been thinking about David's language. It's not like anything I've heard before, but there are patterns, linguistic structures that suggest it might be a dialect or perhaps a constructed language used by a specific community. Constructed for what purpose? Privacy, protection. Some indigenous communities developed coded languages to protect sacred information from outsiders." She glanced toward the sleeping boy. What if David's family weren't just random investigators? What if they had a specific cultural connection to this area? The possibility opened new questions that made Jed's head spin. He'd assumed David's family were modern researchers, academics perhaps, or journalists following a historical lead. But what if their connection to Silver Point Mine ran deeper than professional curiosity? A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Tom's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon as he approached the window, peering through the curtains at the vehicle parked outside. "Expensive car," he murmured. "Not local plates." The man at the door wore a suit that cost more than most people in Millbrook made in a month. He was perhaps 50, with the kind of confident bearing that came from always being the smartest person in the room. When Tom opened the door, the stranger's smile was practiced and empty. "Sheriff Brennan? My name is Marcus Webb. I represent certain business interests that have been monitoring the situation at Silver Point Mine." "What situation would that be?" "The child, of course. We understand you've discovered a young survivor living in the abandoned workings. My employers are prepared to offer substantial assistance with his care and placement. Tom's expression didn't change, but Jed could see the tension in his shoulders. How did you hear about the boy? Word travels fast in small communities. We're simply concerned citizens who want to help. Webb's eyes moved past Tom, taking in the scene inside. The maps spread on the table, David sleeping by the fire, Sarah standing protectively near the child, particularly given the tragic circumstances of his family's disappearance. The casual mention of David's family sent a chill through the room. Webb knew too much, and he'd arrived too quickly. This wasn't a coincidence. I appreciate the offer, Tom said carefully. But the boy is receiving excellent care right here. I'm sure he is. But surely you understand that a child of his unique background requires specialized attention. My employers operate facilities specifically designed for such cases. Sarah stepped forward, her voice sharp with protective anger. What exactly do you know about his background? Webb's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. More than you might think, Miss Mackenzie. The boy's family were part of a geological survey team that exceeded their authorized exploration parameters. They encountered hazardous conditions and, tragically, didn't survive the experience. It was a smooth lie delivered with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his version of events accepted without question. But Jed heard the threat underneath the polite words. Webb and his employers knew exactly what had happened to David's family because they'd been responsible for it. Geological survey for who? Jed asked, speaking for the first time since Webb's arrival. The corporate man's attention shifted to him with the precision of a targeting system. I'm sorry, you are Jed Clark. I live up the mountain. Ah, yes. The hermit. I've heard about you. Webb's tone suggested he'd heard quite a lot. Perhaps we could speak privately. I believe we have mutual interests regarding the mine's history. The offer hung in the air like poison gas. Webb was fishing, trying to determine how much they knew, and how much they might represent a threat to whatever operation he represented. Jed felt the familiar weight of choices that could reshape everything. The same weight he'd felt 40 years ago when Sam Rodriguez had first approached him about investigating Silver Point Mine. David stirred in his sleep, murmuring words in his native tongue that sounded like a warning. The pendant at his throat caught the firelight, its dark surface seeming to pulse with inner life. I think it's time for you to leave, Tom said, his voice carrying official authority. If you have legitimate business regarding the child's welfare, you can go through proper channels. Webb's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Of course, Sheriff. I understand your position completely, but I hope you'll consider the broader implications of your decisions. Sometimes protecting one person can put many others at risk. The threat was unmistakable now, wrapped in corporate doublespeak, but clear as mountain air. Webb represented people who'd killed to protect their secrets, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again, if necessary. After the door closed behind Webb, the three adults stood in heavy silence. David had awakened during the exchange, his dark eyes alert and frightened. He'd understood enough to know that danger had come calling, wearing an expensive suit and speaking in polite threats. They know about him, Sarah said. They've been watching, waiting to see who would find him. The question is how long they've been watching, Tom replied, and what they're really protecting. Jed pulled out his cell phone, scrolling through, contacts he hadn't called in years. There's someone I need to talk to. A federal agent who worked the original investigation back in '79. If he's still alive, if he's still willing to listen, he might be able to help us understand what we're really dealing with. David had moved closer, drawn by the urgency in their voices. He pulled out his charcoal and began sketching on a napkin, this time drawing Webb's face with surprising accuracy, then adding symbols around it that matched the patterns on his. Pendant. What is it, son? Jed asked. Do you recognize him? David looked up, his young face grave with knowledge no child should possess. He spoke carefully in English. Bad man. Kill family. Want want to kill truth. The simple words carried the weight of absolute certainty. Webb hadn't just known about David's family. He'd been directly involved in their deaths. And now he'd come to Millbrook to finish what he'd started, to eliminate the last witness to crimes that stretched back 40 years. Outside, expensive tires crunched on gravel as Webb's car pulled away. But Jed knew the man would be back. People like Webb didn't give up when polite threats failed. They escalated, and they brought resources that small mountain communities weren't equipped to handle. Time was running out, and the game was about to turn deadly serious. The only question now was whether Jedediah Clark still remembered how to fight, and whether he was willing to risk everything to protect a boy whose family had died seeking the same truth that had driven him into exile 4 decades ago. Agent Rachel Martinez answered her phone on the third ring, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with cases that never truly closed. When Jed identified himself, the silence stretched long enough that he wondered if she'd hung up. "Jedediah Clark," she finally said. "I wondered if you were still alive." "Barely. I need to talk to you about Silver Point Mine. That case was closed 40 years ago." "No, it wasn't. It was buried under an avalanche and a lot of convenient paperwork. But it's not closed, Rachel. Not even close." The conversation that followed took place in Sarah's kitchen, while David slept fitfully in the next room, his dreams haunted by memories that seemed to span generations. Martinez listened without interruption as Jed explained about finding the boy, about Webb's visit, about the maps and photographs that suggested a conspiracy reaching back decades. "The boy's family were part of a survey team," Martinez said finally. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, Professor James Standing Bear, and 3 graduate students. They had federal permits to study geological formations in the area, but they went missing 8 months ago." "What kind of study?" "Rare earth minerals. The kind that make cell phones and electric car batteries work. The kind that nations go to war over." Martinez's voice carried the weight of classified knowledge. Their preliminary reports suggested significant deposits in the Silver Point area. Then they disappeared. Sarah had been listening from the doorway, her face pale with understanding. "David's the only survivor. He's been living in that mine for 8 months, waiting for someone to find him. Or waiting for someone he could trust," Jed said. "The question is why he trusted me." The answer came from David himself, who had awakened and stood listening in the doorway. He approached the table where they sat and pulled out a folded paper from his jacket, research notes in his family's handwriting, documenting their investigation into the 1979 incident. "They were looking for you," Martinez said, reading over the notes. "Dr. Vasquez had tracked down references to your original investigation. They knew you'd kept evidence, and they were hoping to find you. Instead, they found the people who killed Sam, Harold, and Danny." David nodded solemnly, then began drawing again, this time showing men with guns, corporate logos, and mining equipment. The story that emerged from his sketches was chilling. His family had discovered not just rare earth deposits, but evidence of the original cover-up. They'd been systematically eliminated to protect secrets that had grown more valuable with time. Webb's company, Meridian Resource Development, they've been quietly acquiring mineral rights throughout the region, Martinez explained. "On paper, it looks legitimate, but if they've been sitting on illegal claims for 40 years, waiting for the right moment to exploit them, they're looking at billions of dollars in profits," Sarah finished. "More than enough to justify murder." Tom Brennan had been quiet through most of the conversation, but now he leaned forward with the focused intensity of a lawman who'd found his target. "We need those documents from Denver. The evidence Jed kept. It's the only way to prove what really happened." "Assuming it's still there after 40 years, Jed said. David reached across the table and touched Jed's hand, speaking softly in his native tongue. Then, switching to English, "Family. Family say you good man. Say you help. Before you help now." The trust in the boy's eyes cut through 40 years of carefully constructed isolation. This child had lost everything: family, home, innocence, but he still believed that justice was possible, that good people existed who would risk themselves for strangers. Martinez, I need federal protection for the boy and anyone helping him. And I need an escort to Denver to retrieve that evidence. I can't authorize that kind of operation based on what? A massacre? Corporate conspiracy? Mineral rights worth more than most countries' GDP? Jed's voice carried an edge that reminded everyone in the room that he hadn't always been a hermit. How many more people have to die before someone official gives a damn? The phone went quiet, except for the sound of Martinez typing on a computer. Finally, there have been other incidents. Missing researchers, unexplained accidents, investigative journalists who died in car crashes, all connected to mineral exploration in Colorado, all within the last 5 years. They're accelerating, Sarah said. Something's changed, some pressure, that's making them more aggressive. David had been listening with the fierce concentration of someone whose life depended on understanding every nuance. Now he pulled out his pendant, holding it up to catch the light. The dark stone seemed to pulse with inner fire, revealing patterns that shifted like living things. "What is that?" Martinez asked, her voice sharp with sudden interest. David spoke. Carefully in English, "Sample, from deep place, very rare, very valuable." The room went silent as the implications sank in. The pendant wasn't just a cultural artifact. It was a specimen of the very minerals that people were dying for. David had been carrying evidence of the deposit's value around his neck for 8 months, not understanding that it made him the most wanted child in America. Jesus Christ, Tom breathed. They don't just want to silence him, they want what he's carrying. No wonder Webb was so interested in taking custody, Sarah added. Get the boy, get the sample, eliminate the witness. Clean and simple, Jed felt. The weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar yoke. He'd run from this kind of responsibility once before, choosing safety over justice, isolation over engagement. The price of that choice had been 40 years of guilt and 3 good men in unmarked graves. Martinez, I'm going to Denver tomorrow to get that evidence, with or without federal protection. It's too dangerous. Webb's people will be watching. Then, you better make sure they're watching the wrong thing. Jed looked around the table at faces that had become unexpectedly dear to him. Sarah, can you and Tom keep David safe for 48 hours? Of course, but no buts. This ends now. One way or another. David stood up, his thin frame straightening with determination that seemed far older than his years. He removed the pendant from around his neck and placed it carefully on the table. Take, he said in English. Proof. Justice for family. The dark stone caught the lamplight, revealing depths that seemed to hold the secrets of mountains and time itself. It was beautiful and terrible, and worth more money than any of them could imagine. It was also the key to bringing down a conspiracy that had lasted 4 decades and claimed uncounted lives. Jed picked up the pendant, feeling its weight. Not just the physical mass, but the burden of trust and responsibility it carried. A boy who'd lost everything was placing his faith in a man who'd spent 40 years running from exactly this kind of choice. Outside snow had begun to fall, the first of the season, dusting the mountains with white that would soon become the deep cold of winter. Time was running short in more ways than one. Soon the high passes would be impassable, cutting off escape routes and trapping everyone in the valley with whatever forces Webb chose to bring against them. The game had moved beyond threats and corporate maneuvering. Now it was about survival, justice, and whether an old man who'd lost his way could find it again in time to save a child who deserved better than the world had given him. The drive to Denver took 6 hours through mountain passes already dusted with snow. Jed made the trip alone despite Martinez's protests, reasoning that a federal escort would only attract the attention they were trying to avoid. The pendant lay heavy in his pocket, its strange weight a constant reminder of the trust David had placed in him. The safety deposit box, had waited 40 years in the basement of First National Bank, its contents preserved behind steel and legal protections that had outlasted the institution's original management. When the banker led him down the narrow stairs to the vault, Jed felt like he was descending into his own past. Box 1247 was larger than he remembered, its contents more extensive than his memory had preserved. Manila envelopes filled with photographs, mineral samples sealed in laboratory bags, survey maps marked with coordinates and dates, and at the bottom a cache of documents that made his blood run cold. The hidden cache wasn't what he'd expected to find. These weren't just his investigative notes. They were corporate communications, internal memos from Meridian Resource Development, and geological surveys that predated the official discovery of rare earth deposits by 30 years. Someone had been feeding him information from inside the company, someone who'd known exactly what was happening at Silver Point Mine. The memos painted a picture of systematic deception stretching back to the 1960s. Meridian had known about the mineral deposits decades before they'd acquired the mining rights, had conducted illegal extraction operations under cover of legitimate silver mining, and had eliminated anyone who threatened to expose their activities. But it was the final document that changed everything. A letter addressed to him personally, dated November 16th, 1979, the day after the avalanche. The handwriting was Sam Rodriguez's, but the words revealed a truth that 40 years of guilt had hidden from him. "Jed," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something's happened to us, and the contingency plan has activated. I'm sorry. We couldn't tell you the whole truth, but we had to be sure. You weren't just investigating Silver Point Mine, you were the bait. We needed Meridian to think they'd identified their leak, to feel safe enough to make a mistake that would expose the entire operation." The words hit him like physical blows. He hadn't failed Sam, Harold, and Danny. He'd been their secret weapon, the visible investigator who drew attention while they worked in shadows to gather evidence. The three men had sacrificed themselves knowingly, trusting that their deaths would provide the proof needed to bring down the conspiracy. The avalanche wasn't an accident, and it wasn't random corporate murder. It was a message, carefully planned and perfectly executed. We let them think they'd won, that all the evidence died with us. But they were wrong, Jed. The evidence survived in your safety deposit box, and more importantly, it survived in the people who knew how to read it. The letter continued with details that reframed everything Jed thought he knew about the investigation. Sam Rodriguez hadn't been just a concerned prospector. He'd been a federal agent, working deep undercover to infiltrate Meridian's operation. Harold and Danny had been part of an indigenous rights organization, fighting to protect sacred lands from illegal exploitation. Your guilt has been our greatest protection, Jed. Meridian thinks you ran because you were afraid, because you felt responsible for our deaths. They never imagined you were preserving evidence we died to protect. But someday, someone will come looking for the truth, and you'll know it's time to finish what we started. At the bottom of the letter, Sam had drawn a symbol, the same geometric pattern that decorated David's pendant. Jed sank into the vault's single chair, the implications crashing over him like an avalanche of revelation. David's family hadn't found him by accident. They'd been sent by the same organization Sam had worked for, following breadcrumbs left decades earlier by men who'd known their investigation would outlive them. The pendant wasn't just a mineral sample, it was a key, carrying genetic markers and isotopic signatures that would prove the rare earth deposits had been illegally extracted for decades. David's grandfather had been Danny O'Brien, the indigenous activist who died in the avalanche. The boy was carrying forward a family legacy of resistance that stretched back generations. His phone rang, Sarah's voice tight with controlled panic. "Jed, you need to get back here. Webb's people have been asking questions in town. They know. You went to Denver. How long do I have? Hours, maybe less. Tom's moved David to a secure location, but they're closing in. And Jed, there's something else. Agent Martinez found records of your original investigation. You weren't freelancing. Were you? You were federal law enforcement. The final piece of his buried past emerged like a corpse from deep water. Special Agent Jedediah Clark, FBI, assigned to investigate mineral rights fraud and corporate corruption in Western mining operations. The hermit identity had been so complete, so thoroughly assumed, that he'd almost convinced himself it was real. I was undercover for 3 years, he admitted. When Sam, Harold, and Danny died, the Bureau pulled me out and gave me a new identity. Witness protection, they called it, but really it was early retirement. They thought the case was dead. Well, it's not dead now, and neither are you. Get back here, Jed. We need you. The drive back to Millbrook took place in gathering darkness, snow falling harder now and slicking the mountain roads. Jed pushed his old truck as hard as he dared, the cache of documents riding shotgun like a passenger made of dynamite and justice. He was 10 miles from town when the roadblock appeared, professional, efficient, and definitely not law enforcement. 2 black SUVs blocked the highway, their occupants dressed in tactical gear that screamed private security. Jed pulled over before they could signal him to stop, his mind racing through options that all seemed to end badly. These weren't the kind of people who accepted explanations or responded to reason. They were problem solvers, and he was a problem that had grown too big to ignore. The man who approached his driver's window was military, no question. The bearing, the awareness, the casual competence with the submachine gun slung across his chest. But his eyes held something Jed recognized from his own mirror during the dark years, the hollow look of someone who'd compromised too much for too long. Mr. Clark, you're going to need to come with us. On whose authority? People who pay better than the federal government and ask fewer questions. The man's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd stopped believing in right and wrong. The boy, the evidence, the whole situation. It ends tonight, one way or another. Jed looked at the documents beside him. 40 years of carefully preserved truth that could finally bring justice to good people who died protecting it. Then he thought about David, sleeping safely somewhere in the mountains, trusting that the adults in his life would keep him safe. The pendant in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, reminding him that some things were worth more than personal safety. Some truths demanded to be told regardless of the cost. I'll come with you, he said quietly, but the documents stay here. The mercenary smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I'm afraid that's not how this works, Mr. Clark. Everything comes with us. Evidence, witnesses, loose ends, all of it gets cleaned up tonight. As they zip-tied his hands and searched his truck, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced in 40 years, the cold clarity that came with knowing you were about to die for something that mattered. The fear was there, sharp and immediate, but underneath it lay a deeper satisfaction. He quote, "To spent 4 decades running from responsibility, hiding from the consequences of choices that had gotten good people killed. Now, finally, he had a chance to balance the scales, to honor the sacrifice." Sam, Harold, and Danny had made the black SUVs carried him into the darkness, toward whatever end Webb's people had planned. But they were making a crucial mistake. They thought they were dealing with a frightened hermit who'd stumbled into something beyond his understanding. They had no idea they'd just kidnapped a federal agent who'd spent 40 years preparing for exactly this moment. The old mine office had been converted into a command center, complete with satellite communications, tactical displays, and enough firepower to outfit a small army. Webb stood before a wall of monitors showing thermal imaging from around Millbrook, his expensive suit replaced by tactical gear that looked disturbingly natural on him. "Agent Clark," he said without turning around, "or do you prefer Jedediah? It's been a long time since anyone used your real name." Jed tested the zip ties, securing him to a metal chair, finding them professionally applied and escape-proof. The room smelled of gun oil and electronic equipment, overlaid with the musty scent of a mine that had been sealed too long. 40 years of careful planning, Webb continued, gesturing at the displays. Do you have any idea how much patience that requires? How many variables had to be controlled? How many loose ends tied off? Like Sam Rodriguez and his team. Like everyone who got too close to understanding what we were really protecting here. Webb finally turned, his face carrying the satisfied expression of someone explaining his masterpiece. This was never about silver, Agent Clark. It was never even primarily about rare earth minerals, though those deposits alone are worth hundreds of billions. On the central monitor, thermal images showed Sarah's clinic, Tom Brennan's house, and a dozen other locations around Millbrook. Red dots marked the positions of armed personnel, closing in on anyone who might pose a threat to Webb's operation. Then, what was it about? Webb smiled, pressing a button that changed the display to geological surveys showing the true extent of the Silver Point deposit. The mineral veins extended for miles underground, following fault lines that connected to other mining operations across 3 states. Control. The rare earth minerals in these mountains represent the future of American technology. Everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems depends on these elements. China controls 90% of world production, which gives them leverage over every major economy on Earth. So you decided to build your own monopoly. We decided to ensure American technological independence. The methods were regrettable, but necessary. Webb's voice carried the casual certainty of someone who'd rationalized mass murder as patriotic duty. Your friend Rodriguez understood that eventually. Before he died, he admitted that our goals aligned, protecting American interests from foreign exploitation. The lie was smooth and practiced, but Jed had read Sam's real words, had seen the evidence of Webb's systematic elimination of anyone who threatened his operation. This wasn't patriotism. It was greed, dressed up in flag-waving rhetoric. What about the boy? David Vasquez O'Brien represents a unique problem. His genetic heritage gives him legal standing to claim mineral rights through indigenous sovereignty laws. His family's research proved that these deposits extend onto treaty-protected lands. If he survives to adulthood, he could tie up our operations in federal court for decades. The casual discussion of a child's murder made Jed's vision go red around the edges. He'd spent his career dealing with criminals who rationalized their actions, but Webb's clinical approach to eliminating a 12-year-old boy crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Martinez knows about your operation. Federal agents are already investigating. Agent Martinez suffered a tragic car accident 3 hours ago. Brake failure on a mountain road. Very unfortunate, but these things happen. Webb's expression didn't change. Her investigation died with her, along with any federal interest in this remote mining dispute. The news hit Jed like a physical blow. Rachel Martinez had been a good agent and a better person, someone who dedicated her life to protecting others. Now she was dead because he'd involved her in his quest for justice. You see, Agent Clark, this has never been about good and evil, right and wrong. It's about necessity. America needs these resources, and we're the only ones positioned to extract them efficiently. A few deaths, even a few dozen deaths, are acceptable losses in service of national security. On the monitors, the thermal signatures showed Webb's teams moving into position around Millbrook. Whatever was about to happen, it would be thorough and final. No witnesses, no loose ends, no evidence left behind to complicate the narrative. Where's David? Sheriff Brennan was very cooperative once we explained the situation to him. The boy is being held in the mine's deepest chamber. Poetic justice, really. He'll die in the same place his grandfather died, protecting the same secrets that have been buried here for 40 years. Jed felt something cold and calculating settle into his mind, the same tactical awareness that had made him effective as an undercover agent decades earlier. Webb was making mistakes, revealing information and positioning that could be exploited if the opportunity arose. You're planning to collapse the mine again, make it look like an accident. Controlled demolition, carefully planned and expertly executed. The old workings have been unstable for years. Tragic that people insisted on exploring them despite repeated warnings. Webb gestured toward a table covered with explosive devices and detonators. These charges will bring down enough, rock to seal the mine permanently. Any evidence of our activities will be buried under thousands of tons of granite, along with anyone inside. Along with everyone inside. You, the boy, Sheriff Brennan, Miss Mackenzie, all the inconvenient witnesses who couldn't leave well enough. Alone, the military surplus explosives on the table were overkill for a simple mine collapse, enough destructive power to level half the mountain. But they represented opportunity for someone who understood demolitions, someone who'd learned to think tactically under pressure. Jed quote S service records lay open on Webb's desk, a complete dossier that revealed his military background in explosive ordnance disposal. Webb had done his homework, but he'd also made a crucial error, leaving demolition equipment within reach of someone trained to use it. Your mistake, Jed said quietly, is thinking this is still about the mineral rights. What else would it be about? Justice for Sam Rodriguez, Harold Kemper, Danny O'Brien, for David's family, for Rachel Martinez, for everyone you've killed to protect your operation. Jed tested the zip ties again, feeling slight give in the mounting point. You think you're fighting for American interests, but you're just another criminal who's gotten too comfortable with murder. Webb's expression hardened. Idealistic nonsense. You've been hiding in the mountains too long, Agent Clark. The world changed while you were playing hermit. Moral absolutism is a luxury we can't afford anymore. Some things don't change. Some truths are worth dying for. Then you're about to get your wish. Webb turned back to his monitors, speaking into a radio headset. All teams initiate final phase. Sweep and clear. No survivors. Execute in 30 minutes. The acknowledgements came back in professional military cadence, confirmation that Webb's people were moving into position for a massacre that would eliminate every witness to 40 years of corporate murder. Sarah, Tom, David, and anyone else unlucky enough to be in Millbrook would die tonight, their deaths attributed to a tragic mining accident. Jed closed his eyes and thought about the dynamite he'd kept in his cabin, old military demolition charges from his EOD days, stored against some nebulous future need. If Webb's people found them, they'd assume they were part of his hermit preparations. They wouldn't realize they'd just discovered the one thing that could turn the tables on this entire operation. The zip ties gave a little more as he worked them against the chair's metal frame. His hands were starting to go numb, but flexibility was returning to the plastic restraints as body heat warmed them. Webb was making another mistake, using equipment designed for short-term prisoner transport rather than permanent restraint. 30 minutes, Webb announced, checking his watch. Then this entire situation becomes history, buried under enough rock to hide it until the next ice age. On the monitors, thermal signatures showed his teams approaching their targets throughout Millbrook. Professional killers with military equipment preparing to eliminate a small mountain community to protect corporate secrets worth billions of dollars. But they were about to discover that their targets weren't helpless civilians waiting to be slaughtered. Tom Brennan was an experienced lawman who'd grown up in these mountains. Sarah Mackenzie was a trauma nurse who'd learned to think under pressure. And David Vasquez O'Brien was the survivor of a family that had spent generations fighting exactly this kind of oppression. Most importantly, they were about to face Jedediah Clark, not the hermit who'd hidden in the mountains for 40 years, but the federal agent who'd learned to fight corporate corruption with every tool at his disposal. The Zip ties parted with a soft snap as Jed worked his hands free. Webb was still focused on his monitors, coordinating the final assault on Millbrook. The demolition equipment lay within reach, enough explosive power to bring down the mine, or to turn Webb's command center into a crater that would eliminate the leadership of his entire operation. Time to remind these corporate killers that some old soldiers never lose their edge, and that mountain justice could be as final as any boardroom decision. The boy in the mine's depths deserved better than the world had given him, and tonight, Jedediah Clark was going to make sure he got it. The first charge detonated as Jed's hands closed around the detonator, the controlled explosion sending a shockwave through the mine office that killed the lights and shattered half the monitoring equipment. Webb spun around in time to see his prisoner standing free, old dynamite from Jed's military days clutched in one weathered hand. "You always were too fond of explaining yourself," Jed said, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime dealing with dangerous men. "Sam Rodriguez taught me that. Never give the enemy time to think." Webb reached for his sidearm, but 40 years of mountain living had kept Jed's reflexes sharp. The tackle sent both men crashing into the equipment table, scattering demolition charges across the stone floor. Webb was younger and better armed, but Jed fought with the desperate fury of someone who'd spent 4 decades waiting for exactly this moment. The radio crackled with panicked voices as Webb's teams reported the explosion. "Command, we have detonation at the mine office. Repeat, we have..." Jed smashed the communication equipment with a piece of mining equipment, cutting the tactical teams off from their coordination center. Without leadership and real-time intelligence, they'd be reduced to following predetermined plans that assumed their targets would be helpless. Civilians. Webb broke free and rolled toward his weapon, but Jed was already moving. The second charge, this, when placed with precision born of military training, brought down a section of roof that sealed the office's main exit. Rock dust filled the air as emergency lighting flickered to life, casting everything in hellish red shadows. "You're insane," Webb gasped, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "This entire mountain is wired with explosives. You bring down this chamber, you'll trigger a chain reaction that kills everyone." "Including you," Jed replied. "Funny how that focuses the mind." Through the settling dust came the sound of boots on stone. Webb's security team, moving through the mine's passages, toward their trapped leader. Professional soldiers following standard rescue protocols, which made them predictable to someone who'd learned to think tactically under pressure. Jed grabbed Webb's radio and spoke into it, mimicking the corporate executive's voice well enough. "To buy precious seconds. All teams, abort current operations. Repeat, abort and return to base. We have federal agents incoming." The confusion that followed over the airwaves told him the deception had worked, at least temporarily. Some of Webb's people would follow orders and retreat. Others would continue their missions, uncertain about conflicting commands. Either way, the coordinated assault on Millbrook had been disrupted. Webb had recovered his weapon and was using the overturned equipment table as cover, but the small-caliber pistol was inadequate for the situation they now faced. The mine office had become a tomb sealed by rockfall with nowhere to run. "You want to know the real joke?" Webb called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "I was telling the truth about national security. Those mineral deposits are worth more than money. They're worth American technological independence. Your idealistic crusade is going to hand China control over the future. Maybe, but at least the future won't include you." Jed had been working while they talked, setting charges with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly how much explosive force was needed to achieve specific results. Too little, and Webb would survive to continue his operation. Too much, and the chain reaction would indeed bring down half the mountain. The tactical situation was complex, but solvable. Webb's remaining charges were designed to collapse the mine's main passages, sealing David and the others inside before killing them with controlled detonations. But those same explosives could be redirected, turned into a weapon against Webb's own operation. "Your people have Sarah and Tom?" Jed asked, continuing to work with demolition charges while keeping Webb pinned behind cover. Safe and secure in the mine's lower levels, along with the boy, all waiting for the final solution to this entire problem. The casual reference to mass murder made Jed's vision narrow with cold rage. Webb spoke about killing good people the way other men discussed quarterly profit reports, necessary business decisions that required no emotional investment. Bootsteps echoed from the sealed passage as Webb's security team worked to clear the rockfall. Professional work, but it would take time. Time Jed could use to complete his own preparations. The boy's grandfather was Danny O'Brien, Jed said, his hands never stopping their careful work with fuses and detonators. Indigenous activist, family man, someone who believed the law meant something. You killed him for trying to protect land that belonged to his people. I killed him for interfering with a legal mining operation. Legal according to forged documents. And bought politicians. Sam Rodriguez had the real mineral rights surveys, the ones that prove this entire mountain belongs to the Ute Nation under treaties your company has been violating for 50 years. Webb's return fire chipped stone near Jed's position, but the shots were poorly aimed, desperation shooting that revealed growing panic. The corporate executive was discovering that boardroom ruthlessness translated poorly to actual combat, even "If that's true," Webb called out, "it doesn't matter now. Everyone who knows dies tonight, and tomorrow we continue operations under new management. The minerals get extracted, America gets the strategic resources it needs, and a few inconvenient truths get buried under enough rock to hide them forever." The bootsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of drilling equipment working to clear the passage. Webb's rescue was perhaps 10 minutes away. 10 minutes for Jed to complete his preparations and settle accounts that had been overdue for 40 years. Time to show these corporate killers that some debts could only be paid in full, and that Mountain Justice had a long memory for good people who died protecting others. The original evidence cache had been David's salvation, not the documents Jed had retrieved from Denver, but the proof that had been hidden in the mine itself for 40 years. When the rescue team finally breached the sealed passage, they found Webb's command center empty except for a note written in Jed's careful handwriting. The truth was always here. You just had to know where to look. Jed had used the mine's own layout against Webb's operation, following passages that the corporate teams didn't know existed to reach the lower levels where his friends were being held. The hand-drawn maps David had created became his navigation system, guiding him through tunnels that predated all official surveys. Sarah and Tom were bound in the main chamber, watched by 2 guards who'd been expecting a coordinated assault. From above, not a single man emerging from passages that shouldn't exist. The takedown was swift and silent, techniques Jed had learned in military service and refined through decades of hunting in unforgiving country. "How did you?" Sarah began, but Jed cut her off with a gesture toward the deeper tunnels. "David's family found something down there, something Webb's been trying to hide for 40 years. He cut their restraints with efficient movements, his eyes never leaving the passage entrances. "Where's the boy?" "Deeper chamber," Tom said, flexing feeling back into his hands. "But it's wired to blow. Webb's got enough explosive down there to bring down half the mountain." The 3 of them moved through the mine with the careful coordination of people who'd learned to trust each other in crisis. Sarah had improvised medical supplies from Webb's equipment. Tom had recovered weapons from the guards. Jed carried the detonator that would either save them all or kill them in the attempt. The passage to the deepest chamber was lined with shaped charges, professionally placed to ensure complete collapse when triggered. But Jed's trained eye caught details the corporate demolition team had missed. Stress points in the rock that could be exploited, support structures that could be preserved, escape routes that remained viable if the charges were repositioned. David sat in the center of the chamber, surrounded by carvings that clearly predated any European presence in the region. Indigenous petroglyphs covered every surface, telling stories that connected the mineral deposits to spiritual beliefs spanning centuries. The boy had been placed there deliberately, Webb's final insult to the people his operation had displaced. "Family stories," David said when he saw them, his English improving with emotion. "Grandfather's grandfather carved these. Sacred place, protected place." The petroglyphs weren't just cultural artifacts. They were maps, showing the true extent of the mineral deposits and their connection to underground water sources that sustained life throughout the region. Webb's operation hadn't just been stealing resources. It had been poisoning the aquifer that fed springs and wells for hundreds of miles. "This is why they had to kill everyone," Sarah said, studying the carvings. "This proves the environmental damage, the treaty violations, the systematic poisoning of groundwater." Tom was examining the demolition charges with the eye of someone who'd served in Iraq before becoming a small-town sheriff. "These are set to bring down the entire chamber. Once they blow, no one will ever see these carvings again, unless we change their targeting," Jed said. He'd been studying the chamber's geology, calculating load-bearing points and natural fracture lines. "Help me move these charges. We're going to give Webb exactly what he wants. A controlled demolition that buries the evidence." The work was dangerous and precise, requiring them to handle unstable explosives while Webb's remaining security teams searched the upper levels for their missing leader. Every sound echoed through the mine's passages, making stealth impossible, and speed essential. David proved invaluable, his months of living in the mine having taught him every sound and vibration that mattered. He could distinguish between settling rock and approaching footsteps, between wind through natural vents and the movement of armed men. "They come," he whispered, pointing toward the main passage. 6 men. Heavy steps, angry voices. Jed made final adjustments to the repositioned charges, their new placement designed to seal the chamber's entrance while preserving the interior and its precious evidence. The explosion would look like Webb's planned demolition, but the petroglyphs and mineral samples would survive, protected by thousands of tons of carefully placed rubble. "When this goes off," he told the others, "we'll have maybe 30 seconds to reach the emergency exit before the shockwave hits. David, you lead. You know these passages better than anyone." The boy nodded solemnly, understanding that his family's long fight for justice was about to reach its conclusion. Win or lose, tonight would end the cycle of murder and cover-up that had haunted these mountains for 4 decades. Bootsteps echoed from the passage as Webb's security team approached their position. Professional voices coordinating a final assault, unaware that their targets had turned the mine itself into a weapon. Jed's thumb hovered over the detonator. 40 years of guilt and responsibility distilled into this single moment. The explosion would either vindicate Sam Rodriguez, Harold Kemper, and Danny O'Brien, or it would add 4 more names to the list of people who died trying to protect something bigger than themselves. "For your grandfather," he told David, "and for everyone who died believing the truth mattered." The detonator clicked home, and the mountain itself became their ally in the fight for justice. 3 months later, the new collar around Boone's neck bore only his name and Jed's phone number. No ghosts from the past, no borrowed identities from dogs long dead. The simple brown leather had been David's idea, purchased during their first trip together to the feed store in town, where the boy delighted in speaking English with anyone patient enough to listen. The federal investigation had moved with surprising speed once the preserved petroglyphs and mineral samples provided irrefutable evidence of Webb's 40-year conspiracy. Meridian Resource Development collapsed within weeks, its assets frozen, and its executives facing charges ranging from conspiracy to murder. Webb himself had survived the mine explosion, but would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His dreams of corporate empire reduced to orange jumpsuits and concrete walls. Jed sat on his cabin's front porch, watching David teach Boone to fetch sticks with the patient persistence of someone who'd learned that good things took time. The boy had gained 20 pounds since Sarah had started supervising his nutrition, and his English improved daily through conversations with anyone willing to listen to his stories about family traditions and the sacred places his grandfather had fought to protect. "The adoption papers came through," Sarah said, settling into the chair beside him with 2 cups of coffee and the satisfaction of someone who'd helped navigate bureaucratic mountains. "Officially, you're now the legal guardian of David Vasquez O'Brien." Clark. The hyphenated name had been David's insistence, keeping his family heritage while claiming his place in Jed's life. Federal Family Services had been surprisingly cooperative once they understood the circumstances, and the substantial trust fund established from the government settlement with Meridian's insurance companies. "Judge Martinez thinks it's the fastest adoption she's ever processed," Sarah continued. "Having the Attorney General's office called personally to expedite the paperwork probably didn't hurt." Jed smiled, thinking about the irony of his name appearing on legal documents again after 4 decades of careful anonymity. Special Agent Jedediah Clark had been officially reinstated, honored for his undercover work, and immediately retired with full pension and commendations. The hermit identity was finally, formally dead. Sheriff Tom Brennan's cruiser pulled into the yard, raising dust that made Boone bark once before returning to his game with David. Tom had become a regular visitor since the events at the mine, partly for official follow-up, but mostly for the friendship that had developed between 4 people who'd faced death together and survived to tell about it. "State engineers finished their assessment," Tom said, accepting coffee and settling onto the porch steps. "The mine's sealed permanently, too dangerous for salvage operations, but the petroglyphs are preserved and protected. They're talking about creating some kind of cultural preservation site." "David would like that," Jed said. "He's been working with the tribal elders, learning the old language properly. Turns out, what he was speaking wasn't exactly Ute. It was a mixture his family developed to preserve stories the government tried to erase." The boy in question looked up from his game, grinning at the mention of his name. His transformation had been remarkable. From the feral, frightened child they'd found in the mine to a confident young man who spoke passionately about justice, environmental protection, and the importance of preserving cultural heritage. College. "Funds growing nicely," Sarah added. "Between the government settlement and the mineral rights David inherited, he'll have options when he's ready for them." The mineral rights had been the final piece of justice. Federal investigators had confirmed that the deposits did indeed fall under treaty protection, and David's legal claim as Danny O'Brien's great-grandson was ironclad. Instead of exploitation, the area would become a model for sustainable resource management directed by indigenous communities. "Speaking of options," Tom said, with the careful neutrality of someone delivering news that might be unwelcome, "I had a call from Washington. They're interested in consulting services, cold case investigations, corporate crime, that kind of thing. Seems your reputation preceded your retirement." Jed considered the offer while watching David patiently demonstrate the proper way to hold a stick for throwing. The boy had taught him more about resilience and hope in 3 months than 40 years of isolation had managed. Some wounds healed better with purpose than with solitude. Part-time maybe, cases that matter, but nothing that keeps me away from home too long. He gestured toward David, who was now attempting to teach Boone to sit properly before fetching. "I've got responsibilities here." Sarah's hand found his on the porch railing, warm and steady, and promising permanence in ways that still surprised him. Their relationship had developed slowly, built on shared experience and mutual respect rather than the desperate passion of youth. It was better than what he'd had before, deeper, more honest, grounded in the knowledge that both of them had seen enough of life to recognize something worth keeping. The afternoon sun climbed toward evening, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple that reminded Jed why he'd fallen in love with this country in the first place. But now the beauty wasn't tinged with guilt and regret. The ghosts of Sam Rodriguez, Harold Kemper, and Danny O'Brien had finally been laid to rest, their sacrifice honored and their fight completed. David S. laughter echoed across the clearing as Boone finally managed to sit, stay, and fetch in the proper sequence. The boy's joy was infectious, a reminder that justice wasn't just about punishing the guilty, it was about protecting the innocent and giving them space to grow into whatever they were meant to become. "Jed!" David called out, holding up a perfectly thrown stick. "Watch! Boone learns good!" The old dog trotted back with dignified pride, dropping the stick at David's feet before looking expectantly toward the porch. His mismatched eyes held the same patient intelligence they'd always possessed, but now there was something else, contentment perhaps, or simply the peace that came from knowing his pack was complete and safe. Jed stood up, stretching muscles that ached less than they had in years. "Come on, son, let's see if we can teach him to shake hands too." As they walked across the yard together, Jed felt something he hadn't experienced since his childhood in Kansas. The simple satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged, with people who mattered, doing work that made a difference. The mountains still held their secrets, but some burdens were finally light enough for an old man to carry without breaking. Behind them, Sarah and Tom continued their quiet conversation about practical matters, school enrollment, winter preparations, the SASH. Thousand small details that made up a life shared with others. Normal concerns, mundane and precious, and proof that sometimes justice won and good people got to keep the things they'd fought to protect. The first snow would come soon, dusting the peaks with white that would deepen through the long Colorado winter. But this year, Jed looked forward to the season's challenges. He had family to keep warm, stories to share, and a future that stretched ahead with possibility rather than emptiness. Sometimes a man runs to the mountains to escape his past. Sometimes, if he's very lucky, he discovers that his future was waiting there all along.